All right, well, thank you, everyone, and I'm very pleased to be here, and really thank you for everything and inviting me to be here and share some of my research. I'm going to talk a little bit, like slice of work that I've been doing for a long time on these giving circles and collaboratives. In particular, I'm interested in trying to understand the degree to which these groups, as kind of emerging forms of voluntary association or philanthropic voluntary associations, may lead to greater civic and political participation. So I'm trying to frame this in the context of the research that's been done over a long time on the connection between voluntary associations and civic and political action. Wrong way already. We are all familiar with all the kind of awful things going on in our world right now. We talked about some of these already. You know, global warming, war, poverty, all those things that are going on in our world. Of course, now as an American, we also have other things going on daily with tweets and new policy changes that cause a lot of, stress. I know I start to feel like this guy on many days when I just give up. Some people maybe react, cry for a little while and then go out and organize democracy, demonstrations, or write letters in the paper. Some of us just go down in our basement and watch X-Files for hours on end. But others of us have had other ideas of how to get to sort of make some impact in the context of all of these problems, and they are very locally focused. For example, these guys, Adam Pike and Michael Harris, started Beyond Me in 2011. They were young professionals that were working in these big corporations in London, and they were starting to come into having some money and wanted to do something to be more engaged in their communities, and they didn't feel like doing a direct debit to a charity or sponsoring a friend at a race fundraiser was really very meaningful to them. So Adam and Michael got together and started Beyond Me, and Beyond Me are made up of teams of individuals that are associated with particular corporations. And there's usually a team leader who recruits some of their colleagues, young professional colleagues, to be on the team. And then together they find a charity or social enterprise to work with and spend a year doing pro bono kind of volunteer support to that organization. They also give some money, about 15 to 20 pounds a month for each member. It ends up being about 3,000 pounds over the course of the year. And Beyond Me's been growing quite rapidly in London and across the UK in the last several years. There was another group that started about the same time as Beyond Me in London called the Bread Tin. And similarly, they're trying to engage young philanthropists or young professionals in becoming more philanthropic. But they follow a little bit different model in that the members get together. They're not all at the same corporation. In fact, they intentionally try to recruit people from a lot of different kind of professional fields in London. And they spend the whole year doing research. They pick an area they're interested in, whether it be environmental issues, child welfare, or whatever, and do research, figure out which charities are working in that area, and then ultimately give money at the end of the year to whomever they select or whichever organization that they select. They also give a lot more money, about 1,000 pounds. Each person is putting together, it's sometimes matched by a senior philanthropist, kind of mentor. So they're giving around 15 to 20,000 pounds to a charity after they've done their year-long investigation. There's another group that's also operating in London called the Funding Network. They're actually been around the longest amongst these groups. Started early 2000s by Fred Mulder, who not related to the X-Files Mulder, I think. That's a joke that I didn't go over very well. He's actually Canadian living in London. He wanted to get to know the community. Oh, I got extra time. Thank you. He wanted a mechanism for him and his friends to learn about charities that were operating and social enterprises and projects that were operating in the London area. And so they created the Funding Network as a mechanism to do this. And as opposed to the other groups that I just talked about that are more kind of one-on-one, intense over time for a year at least, These are event-based or giving circles where people come together for one night, charities, 3 to 5, pitch projects to the people that are in attendance, and then the people that are there attending pledge money towards the project. And they usually raise about £5,000 per project, so they're raising 15 to 20,000 pounds sometimes in one evening. This funding network spread also all over the UK and now all over the world. They're working in Eastern Europe. They have a group in the US, South Africa, Australia. So they've really been growing this model, and it's influenced a lot of groups in the UK as well. The final group I want to tell you about is Give Inc., which is a women's giving circle, getting to women's giving circles, which are really actually what we see a lot of going on in the US as well. Groups of women getting together, pooling their money. In this case, the women are giving £1 a day to the group. And then 4 times a year they get together, decide on where they want to give their funding. And this group is interesting in particular because they are giving to women and girls issues, and they tend to even give directly to women who need help funding something that maybe another funder was not willing to fund. They try to be very non-bureaucratic as possible. They don't care about the tax benefit of their giving, and there's a very large social component to this group as well. So all of these groups kind of give you a sense, they're very diverse in a way, but they also share several similarities, or how we've come to define these groups, in that they're individuals getting together, pooling their money and sometimes time, but usually money is the main focus of these groups. Importantly, the members have a say in where the funding is going or where their resources are going. Their purpose is primarily about being philanthropic. So some other groups, like the women's associations you were talking about earlier, there's sometimes groups like that will have a philanthropic component, but their main goal is not to be philanthropic necessarily. For these groups, the philanthropic aspect is the primary aspect. They might have other side things going on, especially like Beyond Me, they do some kind of professional development as well. And these groups are independent of any particular charity or social enterprise. Part of the process is them learning about charities and social enterprises and so on to give to. So I'm really interested in these groups for various reasons. A lot of different ways I've been trying to examine these groups, but one thing I'm really especially interested in is the degree to which these groups, as philanthropic groups, lead people to become more civically and politically engaged. And do they serve as schools or pools of democracy? And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean about those things. So there's a long literature out there trying to understand the degree to which associations or voluntary associations enable or encourage people to be more politically and civically engaged. And some of you are familiar with some of this literature, and a lot of the more recent studies that have been done are really taking these huge data sets and trying to understand some connections. Overall, I would say that this research finds that there is a positive relationship. Sometimes it's stronger or weaker depending on what we're looking at, whether it be, people are looking at, does merely being part of an association have a positive benefit towards civic and political engagement? Does the level of engagement matter, the length of engagement, what kind of activities are going on? So those are all sort of in this realm of trying to understand this work. But still we have this kind of debate that's going on in this literature about the degree to which these groups are serving as schools of democracy in the very Tocquevillian kind of sense of, and Putnam, of course, draws on this too, of these groups help people learn skills and philosophies and virtues that will help lead them to become more civically and politically engaged, so schools of democracy. But Vandermeer and Van Eegen and some others have found that actually maybe these groups are more pools of democracy, they describe them, that they're less about people learning and that leads to the civic and political engagement, but rather they're attracting people that are already maybe prone to being engaged and sort of helps elevate that or magnify that. So that's one of the things I think is very interesting to sort of tease out a little bit with these groups, in particular because so much of the research has been much focused on these really large data sets and getting underneath what's going on. Giving circles allow us a little bit more trying to get into that kind of black box, if you will. That research also has not really fully taken into consideration that the way people are participating has been changing. As the environment has changed, we've talked about, neoliberal policy changing our emphasis on the importance of voluntary association and philanthropy, as well as, similar at the same time, people are not always as engaged. They don't have the same safety net that they once have had. Beck talks about living in this risk society where individuals have to take care of themselves. And these groups of giving circles very much, and I'll talk a little bit more about, people are attracted to them, and a lot of it is because they want to be engaged, but they can't figure out how, but they're busy, they have their own lives, so these groups kind of enable them to connect in a way that's maybe not the traditional voluntary association, join for life sort of way that a lot of the research has examined. These giving circles are kind of more of a part of this reflexive volunteerism movement, as Hassenix talks about, or everyday making, as Bang and Sorensen have described, that people are not joining for life. It's much more fragmented, but still yet a way for people to be engaged. So there's a bigger question here about the degree to which these types of groups that are not traditional voluntary associations can still have some kind of effect on civic and political engagement. So giving circles, as you've already kind of discovered, they come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, different focus areas, different amounts of money that people are coming into them. Some are more formalized, but still not to the same level as some of the big federations of women's associations, for example. And people are joining for a lot of different reasons, but a lot of it is around connecting to others, and then trying to be more effective in their giving and engage in their communities, but also to have fun. I heard many times, you can have fun while doing good as part of these groups. So I've also found that these giving circles are growing in number. In the US, we've just done some recent research to look at the landscape again, and they continue to be growing in number. We know some have died or closed, but there's still a increasing number in the UK as well. We keep finding more and more around the world. These groups are emerging, so they seem like a worthwhile to study. And people are lots of different kinds of people are attracted to these groups, but in particular, and especially in the US, people are coming to these giving circles that aren't necessarily traditionally been engaged in institutionalized philanthropy, or at least we haven't thought of them as much so, like women attracted to these groups, different identity groups. In the US in particular, there's a larger and larger number of African American, Latino, Asian groups, LGBTQ groups, some groups, Jewish giving circles, so different identity groups that are forming. In the UK, not as much identity-based groups forming, but people are coming to these groups, diverse levels of wealth. At least they have some money to give, but wide range. Some people who are more experienced in philanthropy, some new. And we see across these groups then that they're quite diverse, though not very diverse necessarily within a particular group, and especially since a lot of these groups are formed around that particular identity that they're forming. And the research that I've done in the past, more qualitative work that I've done originally when I started to do look at these groups, it is the case that people are learning about philanthropy in these groups. They have opportunities to be engaged in decision making and all the sort of things that you would think of as important to groups that would be democratic in nature. That they are learning. They're definitely learning some things that are going on and building their capacities. Though there does seem to be, from the previous research, there's not a lot of political talk. Like the same, like the women's clubs that you're examining, there's intentionally this political aspect. In the giving circles that we've looked at so far, and maybe this is changing in the current environment, they don't seem to get into political issues or policy issues too much. So even though philanthropy is obviously political, right? People are making decisions. So they anyway offer a good context to look at these bigger questions about even groups that are not necessarily thinking about themselves as political can maybe have an impact on political engagement. So again, this is what I'm interested in looking at. In particular, for the data that I have to share here, I'm looking at giving and volunteering as part of the civic engagement aspects. And then we're also looking at what people say about their participation in efforts to address problems in the community and to change government policy and their participation in other civic and political activities. And we're able to tease out some, looking at the degree to which these change based on people's level of engagement, length of engagement, and number of groups that they're associated with. So today I'm going to draw on some survey data that we have done in the US and the UK, and that included Giving Circle members and people not in Giving Circles. So we had some comparison group to be able to understand the impact of these groups on the members. I've also done a lot of interviews and observations and documentation, but I'm mostly going to focus on the survey data today, just to give you a sense for what we see going on with these groups. So in looking at giving, clearly there seems to be something going on here on the impact of these groups, and I guess it's not surprising since they're meant to be philanthropic groups. But there has been a question since the beginning of these groups to form, like, do they really have an impact on getting people to give more money? And it seems like they do, based on the survey data. We know from comparing the control group to the Giving Circle members that the Giving Circle members are significantly more likely to be giving more. In the US, when we controlled for income, the significance went away. It was still higher. But you can see also that about 2/3 of the survey respondents who are Giving Circle members thought that they were giving more due to the Giving Circle. And especially in the UK sense, the reason why they're giving more, they say, is because they're hearing about the impact of their support and learning about new charities and projects as part of this process. In the US, we found also that as people were in Giving Circles for longer periods of time, and the more Giving Circles they were in, the more they were giving, or significantly giving more. You can see, I don't know how to use this dot thing there, over there. That people in one Giving Circle are giving about half as much as people in multiple Giving Circles. So there seems to definitely be, some kind of effect going on there, and in the UK, definitely. So giving, volunteering, not as much impact, but still, about half people that we surveyed said that they increased their amount of their volunteer time due to the Giving Circle, and that in both countries increased as level and length of engagement increased in the groups. And in the US context, we found that part of the explanation for why only half may be that people were already pretty engaged in volunteering as part of before they came to the Giving Circle. That explains maybe, and probably the UK, some similar things going on there. But again, the longer they're in the group, the more they're engaged in the group, the more there seems to be an effect. I also asked people the degree to which being in the Giving Circle inspired them to want to do more to address problems in the community, or led them to do more to address problems in the community. And about 2/3 in the US, about half in the UK said that they increased their efforts to do so. And in the US, that level and length of engagement, the longer they were in a group and the more they were doing in that group, the more they were likely they were to say that they had increased these efforts to address problems in the community. Similarly, level of engagement was important in the UK. And this quote kind of gets at maybe what's going on here, is that as people are learning about issues and the issues that are being addressed by the charities they're working with, they're more aware and then wanting to maybe get more involved. The changing government policy is a different story compared to what we saw with the other areas. When we asked people the degree to which being in the group led them to want to be getting more engaged in changing government policy, a third in the U.S. and only 14% in the U.K. said that being in the Giving Circle had led them to be more, I guess, engaged in policy. This, in the U.S. there seems to be a greater effect, especially as level and number of Giving Circles. In the U.K., not so much. And the quote here is from someone in the U.K. that I had interviewed. But so it seems that there's not really, even though this person realizes there's a political aspect to what they're doing, it's not something that they connect necessarily with policy and changing policy. So kind of very interesting. We're just doing a new round of surveying in the US, and I'm going to be interested to see if this changes at all, considering our current political environment and the degree to which Giving Circle folks may be getting more engaged in policy. And finally, we had different things that we asked people about their civic and political activities. Similarly, in the US and the UK was a kind of trimmed down version of this list. And what we found in the US, that the index was significantly higher for Giving Circle members compared to the control group, not significantly different in the UK. But in both cases, level and length of engagement was associated with them increasing their civic and political activities. So overall, you can kind of see, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but the yellow areas are the significant areas, and clearly there are certain things that seem to be important to understanding the impact of these groups, especially level and length of engagement. So some of the conclusions that I draw from this research, first of all, is that even though these groups are not the kind of traditional voluntary associations, Join for Life, they seem to be having some kind of effect on people, especially around giving and volunteering, but also awareness of community issues and trying to change those, maybe not so much on policy. And again, maybe that over time would change. Clearly, level and length of engagement is an important aspect of these groups. Especially for pretty much everything except the policy area. But we also found, based on the data and the interviews, that it maybe does depend from the individual and where they're at when they come to these groups. And that's something maybe to tease out further as we go forward. And I guess my conclusion from this, thinking about trying to tease out, like, what is the schools and pools of democracy debate, I wonder, if it's both going on. Right? And do we even need to necessarily have this either or? That probably in these groups, it seems like there's some, the more that people are in these groups, the more they're becoming engaged. Maybe that is indicative of a pools approach, but as people are in these groups longer, there's clearly something, going on there. We know that there's opportunities for them to do some of the skill building and engagement that clearly is having some kind of an effect as well. So I want to, one of the conclusions I draw out of this is that we maybe need to get beyond this schools or pools debate and think about how these two maybe interact and teasing that out further. And some of the work that I'm trying to build on next is really digging in further to understand what it is about these groups that has different impacts. So in the US, this is US case, we were able to kind of look at the degree to which the size of the group had an impact on members. And what we found is that as the group got larger, people were more likely to be giving more, but then volunteering less. They were supporting fewer organizations and had less belief in the positive impact of giving and volunteering. Whereas in the smaller groups, they were more connected and engaged, doing more volunteering, giving to more organizations, and had more belief in the positive impact of giving and volunteering. So it's pretty interesting to think about, like, obviously the bigger groups have more money to give away, but doesn't necessarily help people become really engaged as much, or seems to be some kind of difference there. And the engagement is an important aspect of the sort of schools, pools aspect of things. We also were able to, I've also started to tease out some differences across groups, getting back to the groups that I introduced you to at the beginning. They were all part of the survey that we did in the UK, or their members were. And we were able to start teasing out some differences across these groups. And maybe no surprises here, but beyond me, as really focused on volunteering aspect, their members were significantly more likely to say that they increased their volunteering due to the giving circle, and also to develop and expand their professional and leadership skills compared to the other groups. Whereas the bread tin, who did a lot of their research over the year, said that they used research. They were significantly more likely than the other members to make decisions based on doing research about organizations and learned more about what was going on. That's around charitable sector and charitable organizations. And finally, in the funding network, which has, a lot of these people in the funding network get exposed to a lot more charities because you've got these people pitching projects. And they were also significantly more likely to be giving more money compared to other groups. And also, because the way that these pledging session works, where people are sometimes saying, I'll pledge to give $500 and match the next, or 500 pounds, and I'll match the next 500 pounds. This is an important aspect of what makes that group successful in matching funds. It becomes important. It's important to their members. So this sort of just gives a sense for trying to understand what actually goes on in these groups can have an effect possibly in some of these civic and political areas. And I am done. Thank you.